Hello and welcome to episode number 359. This is the Project Management Podcast at pm-podcast.com and I'm Cornelius Fichtner. Before we start, please don't forget we are a listener-supported podcast. So if you enjoy our interviews, then please visit pm-podcast.com/premium. Your subscription will help keep us going. If you are preparing for your PMP exam, then you know that one of the most important activities is to take many PMP sample exams and answer as many PMP sample questions as you can. But as a general rule, it's not always easy to identify the correct PMP exam answers. Those who pass the PMP exam often report back that the answers are ambiguous, sometimes more than one looks right, and sometimes you may even have to choose the one that is least wrong. So, what are you to do? One answer is that you can work with a PMP trainer who guides you and works with you on those pesky questions. And this is, of course, exactly why I have invited Julie Desot for an interview. As a PMP coach, she has helped many people successfully prepare for their PMP exam and get to the bottom of those questions. So, if you have questions, then Julie knows how to find the answers. Enjoy the interview.
The Project Management Podcast's feature interview.
Today with Dr. Julie Desot, consultant, project manager, and PMP trainer.
Hello, Julie. Welcome to the Project Management Podcast.
Well, thank you, Cornelius. I'm super happy to be here.
So we are going to talk about how to find the correct or best answer on the PMP exam. But I know that while some of our listeners are indeed preparing for their PMP exam, others are probably not. Is our discussion going to be valuable for those who are not preparing for their exam? What do you think?
I think it will be because even though, yes, a lot of our discussion will be about here's how to decipher questions, I think it's also going to be very interesting and helpful for those to say, here's how I can apply PMP methodology for the real world.
Okay. So how long have you personally been coaching PMP exam students?
Oh my goodness. I think about 6 years now.
Okay. And how did you yourself study and prepare for your own PMP exam? When was that and what was your approach?
Wow. Well, that was way back in 2003 is when I started studying. So I took the test in 2004, right before they switched from version 2 of the PMBOK to version 3. And I was very lucky to have a coach, mentor, and manager that was very, very passionate about the PMP examination, the certification, and the fact that he also was very helpful in saying, you know what, Julie, you're coming from a marketing background, going into consulting and all of that good stuff. He goes, I think that would be the perfect mixture to be a good project manager. And in fact, the manager that I say, quote, made me, which is maybe not quite the right words, but I do use it every now and then, again, with the quotes around it. He actually was one of the editors in the main reviewers of the 5th version of the PMBOK. And so he really helped push me to it. He pushed it within the organization that I worked in. And so I did have some classes at night at the end of all of our work days. And then I also did a lot of self-studying with different books, different exam preps, and definitely with a lot of different practice questions.
What is the format of these questions? What do they look like?
Well, all the formats of the questions are going to be multiple choice. So that's nice. So we know it's definitely everything is multiple choice. And every answer or every question has 4 choice answers, or at least 4 possible answers. Now, that being said, with every question, when you read through it, my personal opinion and professional opinion, I believe that you can eliminate at least 2 of the 4 right off the bat. Yes, there are going to be more than one correct answer, But you always have to look at it to say, what is the most PMI correct answer and what is the most correct answer overall? Not just the PMI-ish, but the most correct completely. What is the, as I like to call it, what's the fullest answer?
Have the question style and format and the way they are written and what exactly they are asking, has that changed over the years?
Honestly, yes.
Hmm.
Um,
How so?
so the way I see it is that the way that they've kind of matured the questions is the way the whole industry has matured. So back in the day, like when I took my exam way back in 2004, is it was much more straightforward, much more definition. Nowadays, they say, okay, we still want the definition, but how do you apply it? And a lot of that goes to the fact that project management, in and of itself, the industry is more mature. Not just all this teaching. Okay, is teaching more mature as far as like teaching all the exam prep? Of course it is. The only reason it is, though, is because project management, as in the discipline, is also more mature. And PMI is looking at it to say, okay, if you're learning from all the previous people that have come up before you, of course we're going to be a little bit more mature. Of course the industry is. So of course the exam has to be as well. So I do find that there are more and more situational based type of questions nowadays than there was, let's say, 5, 10, 15 years ago.
And when I read lessons learned that successful candidates post on the internet, then the word ambiguous often comes up in their lessons learned. The questions were ambiguous, or rather, the questions weren't ambiguous. The answers were ambiguous. Why is that? Why do they give us the impression that things are ambiguous?
Well, I think part of that is to the fact that PMI wants you to be able to look at the question and say, what words do I need to pull out? What words do I need to ignore? Because in real life situations, you are going to get all kinds of stuff thrown at you, and you need to figure out what makes sense. What is the information that you need to pull out to actually make a decision? But also with the ambiguous part of it, is sometimes it feels like it is, but it really isn't. So, for example, I get a lot of students that say, well, when we have questions that talk about, for example, closing a project or closing a phase, and they say, well, of course, the first thing I would do is stop work, release my resources, XYZ. They're like, why would I choose the answer that says close project or phase? Well, I'm always like, well, why wouldn't you close out the project or phase? Because part of closing out a project or a phase is stopping work, releasing your resources, figuring out what happened, what went right, what went wrong, what were the decisions that were made, what really happened, what didn't happen. So sometimes it feels ambiguous, but it really isn't when you start looking at the bigger picture of it. What's the bigger picture of the process versus the activities that are within that process?
There are different types of questions on the exam. Some are definitions, some are formula based, some are situational. So I'd like to go through a few of those question types and hear your thoughts about how to approach these question types. And then maybe also you can elaborate and say, how do you help a student who has problems in this type of question through your coaching? Let's maybe start with something relatively straightforward and let's go to a formula-based question. So how, during the exam, should you approach a formula-based question, and how do you help a student who has problems with the formula as you are coaching them?
First and foremost, most important thing, have all of the important formulas on your brain dump. That way you can go to them. You don't have to think about them conscientiously. You can just go to them. The second part, use the calculator. So I had a couple of questions on my PMP exam, and I did the questions, I did the answer, I put it on paper, I was like, okay, I think that's right. Went through my whole exam, went back to it. And so, because I had extra time, I said, okay, let me double check it. I used my calculator. Oh my goodness, my math was wrong. So definitely double check your math with the calculator. Have all of your formulas like your earned value management, your communication channels. Those are going to be the most popular ones. Also your PERT. Have all of those on your brain dump. Use those. Even if you are great at math, use the calculator. That would be my biggest thing about formula-based questions.
Mhm. And how do you help students during coaching sessions? Let's say somebody comes to you and says, you know what, the TCPI formula, the two complete performance index formula, it baffles me. I have no idea what it is, how to use this. How do you take them through the process of understanding and learning this formula?
Well, a couple of ways. First, for the brain dump, I like to look at that also to say, how can we formulate the brain dump where you can memorize the formula to put it down on your brain dump so that you at least have it there? Because sometimes that is one of the biggest things is just what formula is it that you need to use? What formula is it that you need to start plugging the numbers in? And then I go through with my coaching to say, now let's actually understand it. So, like you mentioned, the TCPI, so the Two Complete Performance Index. So, I always look at it to say, okay, well, what does it really mean? So, that particular formula says, you know what, this is how productive or efficient we need to be. And so I know a lot of instructors say, oh, plus and minus is, either good, bad, whatever. I like to always tell my coaching students, I said, you know what does it really mean? Because numbers only tell you so much. You have to actually go in and say, so what? What does this really mean? And so, for example, like with the Two Complete Performance Index, it says, so what? What does that mean about my performance? It means I need to be 100% effective, or I need only 95% effectiveness to meet the rest of my goals.
The next type of question I'd like to look at, also relatively straightforward, are questions about inputs, tools, techniques, and outputs that are mentioned in the PMBOK guide, so the ITTOs. You said yourself, knowledge-based questions like ITTO questions, the fewer and fewer, more questions these days are situational, yet they're still on the exam. So how do you approach an ITTO question on the exam?
Excellent question. That is probably one of the most popular questions that I get right now. So I would say, first off, yes, a lot of people get very scared because if they start, adding it up, you're like, wow, I think there's about 618 of those. It's not that scary. So with the type of questions that are the ITTO questions, biggest part, well, two big parts. One, make sure that you understand what is the purpose of the process. If you can tell me, kind of like the elevator speech, can you give me an elevator speech of what is the purpose of that process? That's going to be one of the biggest parts of the entire exam, in my opinion, not even just for the ITTOs, but definitely for those. Next, if you get a question that says, for example, which of the following is an input to the, let's say, develop project charter process? If you can understand what the purpose of the charter is or develop project charter process, you can look at your 4 question answers and say, you know what, out of those 4 choices, what can I eliminate? Then you can say, based on the fact of what's the purpose of a project charter? Then you look at it and say, okay, if it's asking me which one of these is, let's say, the input, you look at the rest of the answer choices and say, well, what doesn't constitute an input? Eliminate those. So, for example, an input typically is what you need to begin a process. It's documents or a documentable type of item. And then if it's asking for a tool or technique, it would say, okay, well, with the tool or technique, a tool is something you actually use on a process. A technique, how you do the process. And an output, well, what's the outcome? And yes, it could be a document or it could be an update. So being able to kind of decipher through the question through the answers.
So in other words, you do not recommend to your coaching students to study and learn the ITTOs by heart.
No.
All right.
That's correct.
Yeah, moving on to the next type of questions. Those are situational questions that then end with something along the lines of, what is the best thing that the project manager should do at this point? Or what is the next thing that the project manager should do at this point? How do we approach these?
Ooh, that's a good one. That's a very good question. So a few different ways to look at that. One, especially if it looks like a very long kind of question, go to the very bottom, start at the bottom, look at what it's asking you. Go to the next sentence. So, for example, some of the questions might just be like, so what does it mean? So you might have to go to the next sentence above it. You might actually be able to answer it just from those two areas. If not, at least you know what the question is actually asking you, and you go through, read through everything and say, what are the important parts that I need to pick out? The other part with situational is you've got to remember that they are going to put in extra information. Again, not to necessarily trick you, but to be able to say, you know what, as a project manager in the real world, you're going to get tons of information. And you've got to discern and say what's important and what's not important. The other thing, though, too, is page 61 of the PMBOK. We always talk to you about making sure that that is part of your brain dump. Even if it's not saying what is the next best process, if you can figure out where are you in the project life cycle based on page 61, you should be able to say, oh, the next best thing or the next best process I would do is this one. And what do I do within that process? So as a project manager, what do I actually do in that kind of process? What are my actions?
We're moving on to the PMI Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct, because that is part of what PMPs are tested on. My understanding is PMI doesn't actually ask questions on the exam that refer specifically to the various items in the Code of Ethics. They kind of mix it in with other types of questions, right? How do you prepare for that?
Wonderful question. I definitely tell everyone, make sure you read through the Code of Ethics at least once. That is on PMI's website. And how they divide it out, well, first off, they have different color schemes for their actual Code of Ethics, and here's other additional information. So are they going to ask you, oh, what are the 4 core values? No. However, they are going to ask you ethical type of questions, especially, for example, what would you do if someone did XYZ? Well, first off, you're always going to cooperate with the PMI. You're always going to, if you see that someone is lying about being a PMP, you go to the PMI. And you also very much want to look at it as if someone didn't know everything about the situation, what would it look like on the outside? So, for example, with conflict of interest, so sometimes we definitely see there's a very strong line on some of our industries, but sometimes it's not always a definite kind of thing. So you want to definitely look at it to what would it look like to somebody on the outside? Could it look like a conflict of interest from someone on the outside that doesn't know everything? So always look at it to say, if I didn't know everything, what would it look like? A couple other points. So if you are taking the test in the US, for example, procurement and ethics is always going to be about US type of government law or US standards and the way that most organizations work. So even if your questions on ethics talk about, oh, you're in this other country, you have to look at it to say, well, if my country was in America and my country believes these kind of rules and regulations, certain policies, is this a bribe or is this a fee? And that's going to be one of the really big things And even though I know we were talking about ethics, but let me jump over in real quick into procurement. Procurement will be very similar. Well, one, you're in the shoes of the buyer unless the exam says otherwise, but also most of the questions in procurement, unless stated otherwise, are always going to be taking the look at the U.S. federal government kind of rules and regulations. And most of the questions, from what I've heard, is that they were written by people that either were in the U.S. government or had some kind of connection or experience in U.S. government federal acquisitions.
Would it be fair to say that in regards to ethics, even if your culture as a project manager, it's normal that bribes are, passing between people. That is a normal thing in the culture. It's just the way things are done and the way things are handled. Nothing special to you in regards to managing your project and doing work. When it comes to the PMP exam, you have to simply follow the PMI Code of Ethics guidelines and say, no, it is wrong.
That would be correct. You have to follow the PMI Code of Ethics. And especially for the exam, assume that your organization is in the US or that type of culture, that bribes are not good.
All right. And then let's move on to the really big type of questions, the situational questions. They can be short, they can be long, they can be full of misleading information, they can be lacking information. How do you deal with those?
Wow. Well, that's actually kind of about a 15-fold type of question. So with situational questions, again, I would say start at the bottom, read your way up to say, what is it that they're really asking me? So make sure that you, again, what are they looking at? Do they have extra information? But more importantly, look at it to say, unless of course otherwise stated, the role is perfect for the project manager. Not that the role is perfect overall, but it is perfect for you. That if you need resources, you request them because you come out and say, hey, here's my recommendation, and you get it. But you also need to make sure that you're not looking too much at extra information and getting bogged down in it. Do not get bogged down in grammatical issues because some of the questions were not written in English to begin with, first off. And who knows, they might throw that in there just to mess you up. They will throw in additional information that you don't need to know about. But again, that goes back to the real life of saying in real life, you're going to get bombarded by all kinds of situations. Now, the other couple important parts are look at the situation to say, where in the project life cycle am I at? And that's where page 61 of the PMBOK can be very important. Even though we learn it very linear, we keep always reminding everybody that it's more like page 51 in the PMBOK where everything's overlapping each other. But look at where you are in the life cycle of your project. Are you in planning? Are you in executing? What is the situation that you are really in? And do not answer that question as in, here is how I would answer it in my organization. You need to answer it to say, here's how I would answer it in the PMI world.
Based on your explanation, I think it's fair to say that in order to answer a situational question correctly, you need to understand and have a really good grasp of the PMBOK guide, the concepts behind it, the processes, the flows, everything that this framework is trying to teach us and help to understand. Now, let's take this into a coaching situation. How do you help a student to become familiar with these concepts so that they will later on then be able to, say, oh, yeah, I understand what this question is asking. I see where this falls within all the PMI concepts. And based on my understanding on the PMI concepts, this one here is the correct answer. How do you help them to go from, I would like to become PMP certified, to having this kind of deep and ingrained understanding?
Well, I do try to a certain extent combine their real world experience to the PMI role. Although I still make sure that they realize that their real world isn't always what the exam is trying to portray. And I know sometimes people get really frustrated about that, but I remind them also that, though, that the PMI exam, we are trying to say, let's put everybody at the same level, the same playing field, so to speak. And that's where they're really going at to try and make with these questions. And so in a coaching situation, I try and get to know what is the experience of my student, of my coachee, and try and help them to connect it, yes, to the book work, but at the same time, making sure that they realize that with the exam and with the PMBOK, that we really have to look at it to say, again, based on certain assumptions, this is how we need to answer the question. That, again, things are perfect. That, you do have processes in place. And I know me personally, I've worked at many organizations where they weren't. And so I try and help in my coaching sessions to kind of connect those dots, kind of to help them to say, you know what, this is how I do it in the real world. This is how I'm going to have to answer it on the exam. And the next step forward on that is, now how could I take that exam information once I become PMP certified and actually apply it? Because just because you have a PMP doesn't mean you are the most amazing project management ever. I have seen many project managers that are PMP certified. Well, to be bluntly, they stink. And I've seen
I've
others
come
that are very
across a
good.
few of those as well, yeah.
Yeah. So just because you have the certification doesn't mean you're wonderful. However, my personal opinion is I want to make sure that I take those wonderful PMP or those wonderful project managers, get them certified so that they have the credibility. And then now, how can we actually apply it to the real world? And how can we make our discipline seen as the most wonderful discipline ever?
When it comes to the types of questions on the PMP exam, what would you say is the type that your students have most difficulty with, where they really stumble again and again? And how do you help them overcome?
I would say actually the situational ones. And mostly because the exams nowadays seem to be adding more and more situational questions. And again, it goes back to looking at what is it that they are really asking me and what are the most important points. So let me go back to the bottom line and say, what are they asking me? Now let me reread through the question, say, okay, these are the most important points to pull out. Where am I at the life cycle of my project? Am I in initiating? Am I in planning? Or even in planning, am I just in updating planning? So where exactly am I? Because we tend to learn so much of the processes, the knowledge areas in a linear fashion, but we cannot think about the project in a linear fashion. The project in it is, wow, so very much not linear. And so that's where I definitely make sure I teach my students or my coaching participants to say, okay, if we're over here, for example, in direct and managed project work, now where would it go? What does it feel naturally where it should go? Or even just the fact of, as a project manager, if we are in this knowledge area or this particular process, what does it look like? So again, for example, with the work, if we're like being the leader and manager, what are we doing here? Versus if we are over in direct managed project work, we are more of, hey, let's be a facilitator. Let's try and figure out what's going on versus being a project leader and manager of saying, here's the work that you need to do, and let me either delegate it or be a coach, or what kind of servant leader do I need to be? And so looking at just all of where we at in the different life cycles of the project.
What is the best way to practice for the PMP exam? Because we've learned from your own experience a few years ago, it's gone from knowledge-based to really experience-based. It's becoming harder and harder to pass the exam. Because when I took my driving test, before I even went down to the Department of Motor Vehicles to take the test, I had a driving instructor. We sat in the car and we drove around town, and he taught me on the spot how to drive my car. What do you do for the PMP exam?
Wow. Great question. Question. Obviously, you need to read the material. And I know a lot of studies are out there about, read it 3 times or read it once and scan it 2 times, whatever. The key thing is 3. However, I will definitely tell you, whether it was way back in 2004 when I was studying or now 2016 when people are studying, question. Practice questions are going to totally push you over the top. I know that definitely is what got me over my hump of understanding the material in a practical fashion and, more importantly, how to decipher the questions, because that you can know the material in and out. If you can't read the question, decipher it how PMI wants you to, you're not passing it.
Let's stick with the deciphering for a second here. Deciphering requires knowledge of how to do this. Do you actually go through this with your coaching students? Do you have a set moment where you say, okay, we're at this point of our coaching now. We are going to now spend an hour looking at questions, deciphering them. You go through them. You show them how to read the question, how to understand it, how to look at the answers. Do you do that with your students?
Yes, I do. So I actually will go through questions, whether they got them wrong or got them right. So what I do is I send them practice questions and I say, okay, we'll do these and let's talk about them. And it's not whether you got them right, got them wrong, what do you want to discuss about them? And I will actually go through and say, okay, well, with this question, here's the key phrases, here's the key words you should have picked up on, whether it's in the question, in the answer, or whatever. So yeah, again, in my opinion, that is totally, definitely what made me pass. And that's what I push on to my other students for my coaching. And I have gotten such amazing feedback where people are like, wow, I thought I really knew the material, but once I got there, everything you told me about reading into the question or not reading into the question, they're like, wow, it just came to me. It was unbelievable. And of course, that gives me chills all the time.
Okay. I just at this very moment went to Google and I typed in free PMP exam questions, and I have approximately 1,760,000 results where I can find free PMP exam questions. Are free PMP exam questions any good?
Wow. Well, only if your free questions were on the top, because I know you do, Cornelius, offer a few days worth of free questions. Those would be the only ones that I would recommend as, quote, the free ones being good, because as we all know, what you pay is what you get. So in my opinion, yeah, if there's someone offering you some free ones, yeah, you're going to get a few good ones, but overall, like if they're not offering also to say, hey, here's a couple free ones so you can try my product, those I would trust. If it's literally just, hey, here's some free ones, again, you get what you pay for. Are they even the right edition? In fact, I had someone come back to me, a coaching student, and they said, oh, hey, Julie, I found these free exam questions. Can you look at them? I'm like, okay, sure, no problem. Hey, who knows? Maybe this is a good website. And I start looking at them, and they were from the 3rd edition of the PMBOK. 3rd edition? Really? We're on the 5th edition, and the 6th is being written. And they're still trying to give you free questions from 2 editions ago? No, that kind of scares me. Now, at the same time, do you need to spend an arm and a leg on questions? No. You've got to find the right ones and a decent price.
All right. And when I look at these results here, there's just one that I'd like to point out that I have in Google. Oliver Lehmann. Oliver Lehmann offers a number of free questions. He's got, I think, a set of 75 and a set of 175. Those are not just some of the best free questions that you can find out there. Those are also some of the hardest free questions you can get out there. So when you look for free PMP exam questions and you come across the name Oliver Lehmann, you have found good, solid questions out there. So to close our interview, Julie, can you please give us the top 3 things that I should do while I'm reading, analyzing, and answering a PMP exam question?
Well, before I actually answer that, I want to go back to your comment about Oliver. So I love Oliver's website, and you are absolutely correct. So I will actually use some of his questions for some of my either teaching, boot camp classes, my coaching, because what I like about his is they are hard. And the fact that they were not originally written in English, for one thing. And so they are written a little bit different than some of the typical traditional books that we have. So I do like his. But going back to the top 3 things you should do while reading, analyzing, and answering a question. 1, if it is a long question, start from the bottom up. Say, what is it that they're actually asking me? Can I get that from the very last sentence or the second to last sentence? And even if not, what is it that they're actually asking me? Other point is, where in the life cycle am I? So in my project, where in the life cycle am I, and what would I do next? But that being said, what would I do next based on the 4 answer choices? Because it might not literally be, what would you do next? And then the third thing is actually kind of very similar, is whatever the question is asking you, what's the best PMI answer? So even if you get to A or B and you're like, wow, that's the correct answer, keep reading down because it might be the most correct answer. I'm actually going to give you a 4th thing. If you're not sure what the answer is, go from the bottom up. So you have 4 answer choices. You read from A, B, C, D. You're not sure what it is, start from the bottom, D, C, B, A. And sometimes your brain, because of course we're so used to reading from top left to bottom right, sometimes when you read from the bottom up, boom, it kind of triggers something. So those would be actually my 4 top things.
Excellent. Julie, thank you so much for helping us understand exam sample questions and how to approach them. I really appreciate your time.
Well, you're so welcome, and thank you for allowing me to be here. I really appreciate it. I absolutely love being a project manager and love being able to share my experience and my knowledge and just expand this most amazing, I don't even want to call it an industry because it's just, to me, it's a way of life. I love it.
And that was our interview with Julie Desot and how to find the correct answer for a PMP exam sample question. If you are preparing for your PMP exam, then the best way to calm your butterflies in your stomach is to take practice exams. And of course, our PMP exam simulator offers 9 such exams. To see how it works and take a free test drive, please go to freeexamsimulator.com. And that's it. Thanks for listening. As always, you can find us on the web at pm-podcast.com. Please send your emails to info@pm-podcast.com, and when you write, please do tell me where in the world you are writing from. And finally, we have this. John Lennon said, "All you need is love." John obviously never met my project sponsor. Until next time.